I want to ask you about one of the groups that has been sending people around the world to clamor for, and not explicitly, but to implicitly clamor for this economic attack on Nicaragua under left-wing guise, under the guise of Sandinismo. I'm referring to the MRS, the Movement for the Renovation of the Sandinistas. They're a party that has participated in Nicaraguan politics and typically polls around like 2%. I was here when they were at their height in the 2007 election, where they got something like 12% or 9%? 6%. Okay, I was a little bit favorable to them. I doubled it. They got 6%. So that was their high point. But they poll really well among the Western intelligentsia and the NGO world. They poll really well among like the Open Society Institute and USAID, and they head up many of the foundations, these MRS figures. And they have played a really important role in dividing the Western left on the question of Nicaragua right now, and painting Daniel Ortega not only as a dictator, but as a figure with very little popular support. One of these figures, Oscar René Vargas, recently called, he's in France now, he recently went on the opposition channel here, 100% Noticias, and called for hundreds of people, average Nicaraguans, to die attacking El Carmen, which is the neighborhood where Daniel Ortega and his family live. And he said, so what? Hundreds of people will die, but that's what will produce the change we want to see. His son, actually, I ran into him the other day. He had denounced his father as a golpista, as a coup monger. So this is the MRS. Talk about their history, and then give me your impression of reading online the debate that's taking place on social media and in various journals among self-proclaimed leftists about Nicaragua, reading that from Tipitapa, having just experienced a months-long coup attempt.
I think that for decades, probably for centuries, the elite have done politics, right? And everybody else has the job of just sort of carrying out the economic activity that allows the elite to stay where they are. And in Nicaragua, that model lasted for decades and decades until the 1920s, when out of a civil war that the United States got involved in and used as a pretext to occupy the country, a figure named Augusto Cesar Sandino formed his own army to fight against the U.S. presence here. And that army was based upon the idea of a difficult struggle in which elite would cede ground to workers and to peasants, because only workers and peasants have the strength to carry out a long-term struggle for their own interests that's capable of beating imperialism. That was his thesis. And he was really the developer of guerrilla warfare in the Americas. He was the first person to use it. It was successful. The U.S. Marines left Nicaragua after 6 years of occupation. And then Sandino was betrayed and killed by Somoza. The Somoza regime got started. But the reason that's important to keep in mind is that when the Sandinista Revolution successfully took power in 1979, there was a combination of oligarchy families that were very unhappy with Somoza, as well as young revolutionaries from all social classes. So several of the top level, very top level, cabinet level cadre of the Sandinista front during the 1980s were in fact the children of these oligarchy families. For example, the Cardinal brothers, who were the ministers of education and culture, as well as Carlos Fernando Chamorro, who was the editor of La Barricada. So during that time, there was a role for this sort of the black sheep of these oligarchy families to get to be revolutionaries in that context. But as soon as the Sandinista Front lost power in 1990, there was an exodus of these children of the oligarchy from the party because they were used to being ministers. They didn't want to have to be opposition figures in an opposition party. They didn't want to have to defend the gains of the revolution out on the street fighting cops. They didn't want to suffer with the Nicaraguan people. Many of them left and bought houses in Los Angeles or in Miami or in Spain. Many of them went on to write books. And what's interesting is that, yeah, Giaconda Belli, right? Belli is one of the other, famous oligarchy families here in Nicaragua. So these people have led their illustrious lives. They've maintained contact in some cases with the U.S. solidarity activists who gave their time, their energy, their sweat, sometimes their lives to support the Sandinista revolution, and who were often able to make good friends with people who spoke English, people who had high-level positions in the Sandinista front. So the ex-Sandinistas have always sort of had the ear of the U.S. and European left. And this party, the MRS, was formed out of a combination of legitimate grievances with the Sandinista Front at the 1994 Congress, as well as sort of a social democratic tendency, which at the time wanted to reject Marxism, said that socialism was a passé idea, and wanted to form new alliances. So once that party was formed, they sort of started to create their own idea for what they could do. They never had popular support. They never did neighborhood organizing like the Sandinista Front had, and they never went out to defend the gains of the revolution. So as soon as they went into an election, they were able to garner only this classic 2%. Meanwhile, the Sandinista Front, with all of its heirs, stuck with the large majority of the people, suffered with the large majority of the people, and has never had less than 35% support here. So that's really a key to start to understand these two political forces that sort of claim the Sandino tradition. There's a little bit more to it. There's a figure named Monica Bolderano, who has sort of an ultra-left analysis. So we have the MRS, which is a social democratic analysis, which is it's the MRS movement for Sandinista Renovation. And then there's an ultra-left MRS, which is the movement for the rescue of Sandinismo. In both cases, they're the intellectual left-sounding arm of reactionary politics in Nicaragua, which have continually tried to destroy the Sandinista Front and destroy historical memory of struggle to enable the elite to turn Nicaragua into a copy of several other countries where the left has never been able to successfully take power and run a country. The secret here, what makes Nicaragua different, is that there's a historical memory of defeating the Somoza regime and defeating the elite and building a popular basis for a nation. And that memory is what allows Nicaraguans to face imperialism. It's a constant source of strength, and that's what they're going after. So that's my take on the MRS. They're very strong outside of the country. They're very weak within the country. There's not one MRS member in Tipitapa because it's a very working class city. I would doubt that there's any working class MRS members in all of Nicaragua. They do hold enormous sway over the NGO sector, and they are who has been the most agile in receiving foreign support in this country.
Well, it looks like for now the right wing and the Tranquistas and the NGO left have failed in Nicaragua. We'll see what happens over the coming months as they come back for more. They've left behind a trail of chaos, and I think you are living through that